The Crystal Ballroom of the Beverly Hills Hotel glittered with chandeliers and star power in March 1970. Packed wall to wall with Hollywood's elite for the annual Film Society dinner, an evening where directors, producers, and actors who shaped the industry gathered to celebrate cinema and themselves. At table 7, Dean Martin sat comfortably among friends. Frank Sinatra beside him, Shirley MacLaine across the table, and producer Walter Mirisch nearby. Laughing easily, trading stories, and enjoying the rhythm of a familiar night. The mood shifted when Kirk Douglas approached the microphone to present an award for outstanding achievement in cinema. At the peak of his influence, Douglas was revered for films like Spartacus and respected for his fierce convictions. And as he began to speak, his commanding voice carried across the ballroom. He spoke of real cinema, of films meant to challenge audiences and push boundaries, earning polite applause before steering the room into uncomfortable territory by warning that Hollywood was growing soft, choosing safe entertainment over meaningful art. The laughter faded, replaced by murmurs, as Douglas criticized filmmakers and actors who, in his words, had sacrificed integrity for box office security, repeating formulas instead of taking risks. Then, after a deliberate pause, he named Dean Martin. Glass halfway raised, Dean froze as Douglas gestured toward table 7, inviting him to wave, which Dean did calmly as every head in the room turned. With a thin smile, Douglas questioned how many of Dean's dozens of films required genuine acting or challenged audiences, dismissing his career as a repetitive routine. Play himself, sing a song, charm a woman, collect a paycheck, before hanging a single word in the air that sucked the breath from the room. Hack. Frank Sinatra began to rise in defense, but Dean quietly stopped him, his expression unreadable as Douglas finished, and returned to his seat, ironically having just accepted an award for artistic integrity. Though the dinner continued, the atmosphere never recovered. Whispers followed Dean, eyes lingered, and tension clung to the room. Yet Dean remained composed, laughing, eating, and brushing off concern when Shirley MacLaine asked if he was all right, insisting Douglas had only embarrassed himself. Frank, who knew Dean well, sensed otherwise, understanding that Dean's calm often preceded reckoning. After dessert, during a mingling break, Dean excused himself and headed toward the bar, only to be stopped by Douglas calling out that there were no hard feelings. Dean turned and quietly asked to speak outside, and when Douglas agreed, a growing crowd followed him onto the terrace, where Los Angeles lights shimmered beneath a cool night sky. Facing each other, Dean calmly addressed the insult, pointing out the public humiliation, while Douglas defended himself as speaking for art over commerce. Dean countered by questioning whether entertainment and art were truly opposites, then turned the discussion personal, asking how many of Douglas's many films truly connected with audiences, and, more pointedly, how many people actually enjoyed working with him. As the gathered crowd fell silent, Dean described Douglas's reputation for being difficult, domineering on set, clashing with collaborators, confusing ego with excellence, before redefining art itself as not only what appears on screen, but how one treats the people who help create it. Art, Dean said, was connection, joy, and shared experience, whether through laughter or relief from daily burdens, and dismissing that as less was arrogance, not insight. He spoke of his own career without apology, of dozens of films made with camaraderie, friendships forged over decades, and audiences who left theaters happier than they entered, all without cruelty or tantrums or making work miserable for others. When Dean challenged Douglas to ask his own crews whether they enjoyed working with him and invited comparison with Dean's sets, Douglas looked around at the assembled faces, many avoiding his gaze, and for the first time that night had nothing to say. Dean noticed a cinematographer nearby nodding quietly in agreement, and that small acknowledgement seemed to steady him. He stepped a little closer to Kirk, his voice calm but unmistakably firm, and addressed the accusation head-on. Kirk thought he was a hack because he made crowd-pleasing films, because he didn't punish himself or everyone around in the pursuit of what was labeled serious art. But what Kirk failed to understand, Dean said, was that making people happy was not easy. Making them laugh, truly laugh, was hard. Creating something light, warm, and joyful is still at heart to precision, timing, and instinct, and it only looked effortless because Dean had spent years mastering it. Anyone could make the kind of films Kirk made, Dean argued, but if that were truly so easy, why weren't there dozens of Dean Martins? Why hadn't others been able to replicate what he did? Jerry Lewis had tried to make that style of comedy alone and failed. Frank Sinatra had attempted similar action comedy formulas, and they hadn't worked. What Dean did appeared simple, because it required a rare mix of skills most people didn't possess. Kirk had no response, and the silence pressing around them. Dean softened his tone without losing resolve, and made it clear he wasn't attacking Kirk's work or his choices. Kirk was entitled to make the films he believed in, to chase the stories that mattered to him. What Dean objected to was being publicly ridiculed for doing something different. Personal taste, he said, wasn't the same as objective quality, and tearing someone else down to appear more serious or intellectual said more about insecurity than artistry. Someone in the gathered crowd murmured agreement, and Dean pressed on, explaining that the real difference between them wasn't talent, intelligence, or even artistic vision. The difference was perspective. Dean understood there was room for both approaches. Serious dramas and light comedies could coexist, serving different purposes and reaching different audiences. One wasn't superior to the other. They were simply different. The terrace was silent enough to hear traffic drifting up from Sunset Boulevard and palm leaves rustling in the breeze. Kirk stood rigid, staring at Dean, his expression shifting from anger to something quieter and more uncomfortable. At last, he admitted he'd been out of line. Dean agreed plainly. Kirk acknowledged that he shouldn't have called Dean out publicly and offered an apology. Dean asked him to be specific, forcing Kirk to confront his own words. With visible embarrassment, Kirk apologized for calling Dean a hack, for dismissing the artistic merit of his work, for using him as an example to elevate himself, and for doing so in a deliberately humiliating way. Dean accepted the apology and turned to leave, but Kirk stopped him with a question. Why? Kirk asked, didn't Dean pursue more serious roles when he clearly had the ability? Dean considered this before answering honestly. He chose comedy because that was where he excelled. He knew his strengths and played to them. That wasn't laziness or fear. It was wisdom. When Kirk asked if he didn't want to be taken seriously, Dean replied that he already was. By the people who mattered. His crews respected him. His co-stars enjoyed working with him, and audiences loved his films. Awards and critical praise were nice, but they weren't the ultimate measure of success. As Dean cited films like Casablanca and Some Like It Hot, entertaining stories filled with craft and emotional depth, applause began to ripple through the crowd, growing until the entire terrace was clapping. Kirk finally smiled, extended his hand, and admitted Dean was right. They shook, not as rivals, but as artists who had finally found common ground. Kirk's voice carried clearly through the ballroom as he corrected himself without hesitation, admitting he had been completely wrong. Dean's work, he said, brought joy to millions, and that alone had value. He acknowledged Dean as a consummate professional who treated everyone around him with respect, and who had mastered a kind of filmmaking that appeared effortless only because it was executed with extraordinary skill. Kirk admitted openly that his behavior had come from snobbery and bullying, and he apologized not only to Dean, but to everyone who had witnessed it. For a moment, the room was silent, absorbing the weight of his words. Then someone began to clap. Another followed. Soon the entire room was applauding, and many eyes turned toward Dean with a new kind of respect. Not because he had forced an apology, but because of how he had earned it. He hadn't shamed Kirk, hadn't raised his voice or hurled insults. He had spoken calmly, honestly, and allowed the truth to stand on its own. That night quickly became Hollywood legend. By morning, the story was everywhere. Dean Martin had stood his ground against Kirk Douglas, and done so with grace. He had compelled 2 apologies, one private and one public, without spectacle or bitterness. Reactions across the industry were divided. Some agreed with Kirk's original concern that Hollywood leaned too heavily toward commercial appeal. But most sided with Dean, recognizing that he had articulated something long ignored, that different kinds of films serve different purposes, that entertainment has worth, and that making people happy is neither shallow nor inferior. A week later, Dean received a call from Billy Wilder. Billy praised the moment as magnificent, saying Dean had voiced thoughts he carried for decades but never dared express. Making people laugh while telling a real story, Billy said, was harder than people realized, requiring precision, empathy, and craft. Critics often dismissed joy as frivolous, But Billy insisted the best art came from joy, not suffering. Billy didn't just offer praise. He offered work. He wanted Dean for a smart comedy project, promising to send the script and reminding him never to let anyone diminish the gift of making people happy. After the call, Dean sat quietly, reflecting on the idea that joy itself could be a rare and meaningful contribution. In the months that followed, something shifted. Directors known for serious films began reaching out, not to transform Dean into something he wasn't, but to incorporate what he did best. Billy Wilder cast him in a comedy thriller that became a hit. Howard Hawks offered him a Western that revealed new dimensions of his talent. Even John Frankenheimer expressed interest. Dean's career didn't fundamentally change. He still made light films and comedies, but the perception of his work did. There was a growing recognition that his success wasn't formulaic, but the result of a rare skill set. Kirk Douglas experienced his own reckoning. During rehearsals for a new film, he snapped at a young actor, only to be calmly confronted. The actor asked to be corrected without being yelled at. Kirk nearly exploded, then remembered Dean's words about how people experience working with him. He paused, apologized, and tried again calmly. It wasn't easy, but as production continued, something unexpected happened. Performances improved. The crew became more engaged. Collaboration replaced fear, and the work grew stronger. When the film wrapped, crew members thanked him, saying it was the best experience they'd had on one of his sets. Later, and Douglas gently confirmed what Dean had shown him. His intensity often crossed into difficulty, and the difference this time was that Dean hadn't attacked him. He'd simply shown him the consequences. That was why it finally landed. What made Dean's response so powerful was that he never attacked Kirk's character. He focused instead on behavior, on choices rather than inherent flaws, and that made his words impossible to dismiss. A few days later, Kirk called him. Dean recognized the voice immediately. Kirk Douglas asked if he had a moment, and Dean told him he did. Kirk said he wanted to thank him, not for defending himself, but for what he'd said about how Kirk treated people. He admitted he'd been thinking hard about it, making changes on his next project, and that the shift had already made him a better director. Dean was quiet for a beat before responding honestly. He hadn't set out to change Kirk, he said. He'd simply been standing up for himself. Kirk agreed, but added that Dean had been right about all of it. He admitted he'd confused ego with excellence for years, and that it cost him relationships and, quite possibly, the quality of his work. When you're obsessed with control, Kirk said, you miss what others can bring to the table. Dean replied that he was glad something good had come out of the confrontation. Kirk was too, and before hanging up, he mentioned a new war film he was developing and a role he thought would suit Dean perfectly. Dean hesitated. Working together after everything that happened wasn't an easy thing to imagine, but Kirk sounded sincere, and Dean believed in second chances. He asked for the script. Kirk promised to send it and offered another apology, acknowledging that Dean wasn't a hack, but an artist who had mastered a specific form of filmmaking, one he'd been too narrow-minded to appreciate. Dean thanked him, genuinely moved. Kirk added that he'd spent his career chasing critical approval, while Dean had something far better: the love of audiences and the respect of the people he worked with. That, Kirk said, mattered more than any award. They never ended up making that war film together. Scheduling conflicts intervened, but they remained cordial, nodding at industry events and exchanging polite conversation. Years later, Kirk even presented Dean with an award and publicly praised his professionalism. There was no deep friendship, but there was mutual respect, and Kirk never again publicly criticized another actor. He still had opinions, still believed some films were better than others, but he learned to express those views without tearing people down or using others as examples to elevate himself. In 1986, while promoting his autobiography, Kirk was asked about his past feuds, including the infamous Film Society dinner. He winced, calling it one of his least proud moments. He admitted he'd been pompous, trying to prove his seriousness by belittling someone whose approach differed from his own. Dean, he said, had shut him down without cruelty, defending his work with dignity and forcing Kirk to confront his own snobbery. The experience changed how Kirk approached people,